Maybe we can change the, it's. Awesome.
Some of you have already met some of the members of our team. So we have Julie Demuth, we have Andrea Schumacher, Amy McGovern that you met yesterday at the panel, Dr. DJ John Gagne, we have Sarah Kern, and there are some other, and also Samir Saab, and we have some other members that are not here, and
Yeah, I can introduce those. We have Gabrielle Wong-Parody from Stanford University. She's also a co-PI on the overarching project that includes this Hack Week. Also from NCAR, we have Rebecca Morris and Robert Presley, and also from Stanford, we have Natalie Herbert. So threads, that's a big part of the CAT acronym, but what does that mean? I keep talking about this overarching project, and this is a project through NOAA, the Social Data Insights Initiative, is that right? SDII has funded this project, and it had three main threads that were a part of it. Thread one, which we won't be talking about too much here, but that involves some past survey data that we collected on Hurricane Ian and really focusing in on the inland flooding piece of that data. Thread two is this hackathon. And thread three was a pilot study to assess the dynamics of inland rainfall flooding risk perceptions, information use responses for a 2023-24 season atmospheric river event in California. So that's what I'm gonna be focusing on today and next. And that's the collaborating across threads piece. Those are the threads we're trying to pull together for this project. So, next slide. So the case that we're focusing on for this project was an atmospheric river event that took place in Southern California in late March of this year. This happened to be, it's worth noting, in the days leading up to Easter Sunday. So it's a particularly interesting case because we know that there are a lot of behaviors that are associated with the holiday that we also need to keep in mind as we do our analyses. So, and this is just some of the impacts of this event. You probably didn't hear about it, honestly, on the national news. There've been a lot bigger atmospheric river events over this last season, and especially last season, there were quite a few. However, there were some local impacts that were quite important. So this event, the flooding was located mostly between San Diego and Los Angeles. That's where the maximum precipitation happened, and it happened over the matter of 2 to 3 days. So from March 29th to April 1st. And you can see some houses got flooded. There was hail, that kind of hail that piles up like a snowstorm, which impacts drainage as well as road flooding. And also some heavy road flooding on a major highway, just on the south end of Los Angeles. That's a major thoroughfare that caused major backups. It was closed for, I think, 6 to 8 hours. So this had some very, very strong localized impacts. So we were in the position where we wanted to field some surveys to look at certain dimensions of how people responded to this event, including their information use, their risk perceptions, and their behaviors, their protective behaviors and responses. So this is just, so we wanted to deploy these surveys up to 4 to 5 days ahead of the actual flooding event. So we had to rely on forecasts in order to figure out where to deploy the surveys and when. So here are a couple of the more large-scale forecasts that get made by the Weather Prediction Center. They're responsible for the big rainfall forecasts in the United States. And we saw that the sort of bullseyes were in the Southern California area. So we decided to field surveys everywhere in the red here. That was our spatial domain. Time-wise, so this is a very interesting and sort of novel methodology that we were using because we want to do longitudinal panel surveys. Longitudinal means we are administering the same survey over time. In this case, we wanted to do roughly 5, 3, and 1 days prior to the event. And panel means we wanted to ask the same people. So we want to track from these people how their information use, their behaviors, their thoughts, how they're changing with time. Because if you can think about any sort of weather event, like a hurricane or an atmospheric river, what you're doing at 5 days out is very different than what you're doing at 1 day out or how you're feeling and thinking. So this is a really important social science concept that we think is very important in terms of the overall perspective of data collection for social sciences around extreme weather events. So this was sort of our ideal. We wanted to collect, like I said, a predictive wave one about, sorry, that's here. Oh, they're backwards. No. This is our decision field, sorry. We have like 3 different versions of this timeline. So I got a little confused at which one this was. But we had our wave one, which was started on the 27th, and went through the 28th. So it was a 24-hour period of survey data collection. And then we took 24 hours off. And we did another wave, wave two, 24 hours off, and then wave three. And, actually, do you want to hit that again? Yeah. And just, to get a more broad perspective, we surveyed everyone again, about 10 days after the event, so that we knew that hopefully they were done sort of dealing with the event, and we could get sort of that broad perspective of what happened. And I just wanted to note that this is part of a larger project. We've actually done this methodology of survey collection for 3 tropical cyclones at this point. And this is our first atmospheric river event, and we're online to do another atmospheric river and tropical cyclone this coming year. So, and I put a little link here to our NOAA report, so you can kind of get if you want to know more about our methodology. So for this particular collaborating across threads, we wanted to focus in on one sort of guiding research question. And so what we chose was the idea of driving and flooding. It's a big deal. That's how a lot of fatalities happen in flooding events, people driving through water. And so one of the questions we asked in our survey had to do with people, whether or not people changed their driving plans to avoid driving. And so our focusing research question here was, do people change their travel behaviors as an atmospheric river event is threatening and occurring to avoid driving? And if so, who changes those behaviors and when and how are they changing them? So that's actually, it's a typical research question, and that there's probably about 4 questions in there. But that's generally what our guiding focus is research-wise, So here are the results from that post survey. So afterwards, we asked people to tell us if they changed or canceled their plans to reduce or avoid driving at any time during the atmospheric river. And you can see about 45% of people said yes, they did. So that's promising. And you can further break that down because we do have demographics on all the people we surveyed. So you can see that these are the demographics of our full sample, and then these are the demographics of these 2 different subgroups. And it turns out they're about 50-50 of our group, 45-55. And I'm not going to go into the details here, but this is just to illustrate how we can start looking at this analysis of who is changing their driving patterns and potentially start looking deeper into our survey results to get more clues onto maybe why. But another key piece of these surveys is we actually know when people may have changed their driving behaviors, because we asked them at each wave whether or not they had changed their plans in the 24 hours prior. So you can see, there's a pattern here. It looks like that went from 34% to 40% of the people reported changing their driving behavior. So more people are probably doing it closer to the event. But we can also take that and combine it with knowledge that we have about when did it rain, when did it flood, when were warnings put out, when were evacuation orders issued. And so this is in itself a data integration problem of understanding the context under which people were actually reacting to risk and how that risk was unfolding. So we're kind of expanding the CAT research evidence though, because this is not the only data set we can use to look at driving patterns during this event. So Jorge is going to take over here in a minute and talk about some other data sets that we want to look at to combine with our survey data. And we want to ask some more methodological questions here too, which includes how do different data sets individually and together answer these questions? Where are there similarities and where are there differences? If we look at another data set on actual driving patterns, are we going to see 40% reduction in driving? I suspect not. And I think that that's going to be a really interesting thing to dig deeper into. And how can we have a focused examination on population disparities? What types of data are needed to meaningfully explore these groups, and what can we learn in doing so? So this sort of tees it up for Jorge and our search for better data or more data, I should say.
So as Andrea was mentioning, we are looking at multiple data sources to address this question. So some of these data include the longitudinal data that is the one that we explained. ACA's data, the mobility data, which is the one that is gonna be crucial for us, as well as some weather and remote sensing data. For the mobility data, we were looking at multiple vendors. So Waze, most of you are familiar with that one. But we were also looking at Dewey, which has data from two vendors that some of you might know. So SafeGraph and Advanced Research. We're also looking at Mapbox, Veraset, and AirSage. In the case of Dewey, the main two datasets we were looking at were food traffic data that is linked with points of interest and the spend patterns data. So food traffic data is produced by SafeGraph, and then spend patterns data is produced by Advanced Research. They give you some insights about some of the behaviors of people during those days. However, when we look at the spatial resolutions for the food traffic data, we have weekly information and monthly information. From the monthly information, you are able to derive some daily data, as we can see here. So you have visits per day, but there are some inherent challenges for our specific application. So the first one, when you have a point of interest like a mall that has multiple stores, each single store is gonna get allocated one visit. So that's the first challenge over there. Also, we wanna infer mobility patterns and driving patterns with this information. It's quite challenging. Now, in our multi-institutional project, we had a major roadblock. So Dewey has a focus with academic institutions, specific universities. However, the first thing, they charge you per amount of users. So if you're an individual researcher, you will have to pay like $150 per month, totaling $1,800 a year. But if you want to produce a paper out of it, and you have 2 or 3 co-authors, then you don't have to pay $1,800, you have to pay $5,400. Now, if you have a team of like 9 people, that goes up to 9,000. And then if you have more people involved, then that can go up to 25,000, or the institutional one that they recommend of $50,000 a year. Now, because NCAR is a non-profit organization, and they use data from multiple vendors, that's the advantage they have. They have data from multiple sources. They have some data that you can use open access free, but the ones that have the details, you need to pay the subscription. So their major concern is cannibalizing the customers of the vendors they're working with. So in our case, because NCAR is a non-profit, they didn't feel that it was a good fit to work with us, and basically that's why this one was one of the major reasons why we didn't use this data set, but also the temporal resolution is not ideal for the questions we're trying to answer. Now, Veraset, this one is very interesting. So one of the best things about this data set is that they have movement and visits. Visits is quite similar to the points of interest that you can get from Dewey or SafeGraph, but the movement data, that's the most powerful data that they have. So each single point is linked with a unique mobile ID. So you have insights of every single device in the region of interest. So this opens the opportunity to get in-depth insights about what's going on. And they do have some ancillary data that they call add-ons that is home to work. So in our case, we wanna better understand the changes in driving patterns. So we need to distinguish a normal commute from something different. So they have the home and work locations for those unique mobile ID. So that can help us to tackle this potential challenge. They also have tips that are clusters of mobility to analyze journeys using metadata. We're not going to be using this machine, but it helps identifying the audience across some platforms like emails. One of the biggest challenges with this data is because we have so much level of information and so much detail that it is possible to get the ID of an individual. So anonymizing this data and make sure that we remain with privacy compliance is important. One of the challenges working with this vendor was communication. So these type of companies usually target larger organizations and more like with other type of applications, more like commercial rather than research. With Waze is wonderful in a sense that it's completely free. However, they require an institutional agreement to give you access to their information. So they have the Waze cities and road segments information that could be useful for our purposes, but because it requires the institutional agreement, we are not considering this data set at this point. Now, Mapbox. So Mapbox has great insights and they sell data, but they usually get this information to like hedge funds and and other type of organizations. And their main business with the smaller organizations and institutions is to provide the back-end support in the app development. So for example, if you are developing an app and you need high-resolution maps on the back, and they have even been partnering with Google. So they will give you the maps and all the information you need. But one of the conditions is that basically once the users of the app are using that app that you develop, they're collecting all those insights. And that is some of the information that we are trying to purchase. So one of these is mobility data. So this one focuses on device density and activity. Similar to Veracet that we have a unique ID, and instead of they giving you the raw unique ID, they aggregate it into 100 meters tiles. So we can see here, this is the Seattle region. So if we go closer, you can see the little dots with an activity index where you have a higher number of devices over a specific time period. Now, they also have some traffic data. They claim that this is for more than 700 million active users. And what they do, they give you the vehicle density data at a specific time of the day, a specific hour. So they do 5 minutes aggregation, and then they have an hourly data set. However, which is really helpful for our purposes as we have an activity index, so you can tell which roads are seeing an increase or changes in those driving patterns. However, there are a few challenges. So the first one, because the purpose of this data that they sell is commercial. So we want to have better insights into the product we're putting into the market. They usually, even though they have the data hourly, they usually provide it at a daily time scale. So for hourly, you have to negotiate with them. Vendor communication has been a major challenge. So we have been trying to access this data since June, and emails back and forth has been a major delay. Also, because this is slightly outside what they focus on, their price at this point is $15,000 per year, focusing only on the mobility data set. The vehicle density, which requires more data procurement, is not even including this quote. So with a minimum commitment of 2 years, so $30,000 is quite a high steep price on this data set. Now we have EarthSage, which gives you something in between what you find with Veracet and Mapbox. So you will have the mobility data. So you have an origin destination data, but you also have a vehicle trajectory data. So this vehicle trajectory data is usually from commercial vehicles and from rental cars, which can be helpful for certain applications, but in our specific case, it left out a portion of the population that we are interested. So if you look at these figures, for example, we have the vehicle type. So we have buses, private cars. So private, if you have the device from the insurance, so that insurance provider is giving this data to the vendor. You have truck, unknown, and van. But each car has a unique vehicle ID. So you are able to track the movement of a given vehicle that you want or a specific type. So for example, on top, here we're tracking one specific vehicle for like a 3-hour time range in New Hampshire. Okay.
Do you want me to do next steps? Sorry. So, next steps. Well, we were hoping to come here and have our mobility data and work together on integrating those data sets. However, I think this is actually pretty valid because choosing the data, it has to be very purpose driven. And that is a really big process, especially when you're dealing with tight budgets and vendors that aren't used to working with, the types of research that you're doing. So, our plan this week is to continue evaluating the mobility data, getting sample data, which is so crucial. We've already gotten some sample data from some vendors, and it's really important to have that piece to look at and understand at least, how you're gonna work with it and what kind of biases might be already in that data that you aren't being told. And going forward, we're hoping to create a baseline of driving activity. We want to look at deviation, so we're going to need some sort of baseline that takes into account time of year in that location, takes into account the holiday, the timing adjacent to the holiday, and controlling for known biases, which could be occurring. Of course, we had big changes in activity in the years of COVID, so our baseline has to take that into account. And also, because a lot of these data sets are based on cell phone tracking, and I'm sure you've seen news articles that are like, here's how to turn that off. Did you know your cell phone's tracking you? Turn them off. That's gonna cause a big change in the sample from year to year, depending on that. So these are all biases that we have to really get a handle on before we even dig into the analysis. Then we get to compare and integrate this data and hopefully really dig in and do what I'm calling the real fun of trying to understand how these patterns have changed and potentially move this forward with other projects. So I think it's just a good example, hopefully, of that first step. These are where we're falling down a lot. And hopefully, once we get through this piece, we can apply this to future research. So that's all we have. Thank you. And any questions?
Thing that I wanted to add. I didn't think about this until Jorge was going through the slides. So thank you first to Andrea and Jorge for organizing this. The part we also should have mentioned is that the survey, the longitudinal panel survey data that we collected for atmospheric rivers, we worked with the company YouGov, and the cost of us collecting those data was about $95,000. So we've been doing this for so long that we actually didn't even think about that.
No, that's no problem, right?
I didn't even think about it. So I was like, oh,
Yeah.
I mentioned that too.
You're right.
But I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that, because we really focused on kind of the challenges and the processes and the cost of mobility data.
Yeah.
The survey data collection was non-trivial as well. And like Andrea said, we had been doing this for a few years before this with hurricanes, so we had worked through a lot of those processes and challenges and approaches. So the mobility piece of this was sort of our class. I want to acknowledge that.
So your presentation was great, thank you. And it made me think about one of my favorite papers when I used to use to train graduates is in behavioral psychology, where somebody parks it at a Atlanta shopping mall and is watching people who are encroached upon when they're trying to leave their parking spaces, and do they stay longer, right? And the whole thing, and they do actually, but the whole thing is set up around the concept of territoriality. So I'm thinking about what is your orienting concept? Go back to the start. So you have a bunch of data. You're asking people to report the 4 waves. You're saying that might not be congruent with the mobility data, wherever you get it, however much it costs. But what do you investigate? Is it about reckless behavior during atmospheric river events? Is it about territoriality? Sort of like, damn it, I'm gonna keep driving. Like what
Yeah, right.
what is the concept that you're
So all of-
investigating? I'm just curious.
Right, all of those pieces are embedded, and I'm not sure we can tease out those individual bits, but holistically, what we're trying to look at is protective behaviors that people might take. So we also ask about things like, are you getting sandbags? Are you trimming trees? This is a big list of protective behaviors, of which changing your plans to avoid driving was one of those. And so we're trying to get a sense for, without, necessarily knowing why, we're trying to get a sense, first of all, of if people are taking protective behaviors. And we can take that, of course, and we can combine it with the other questions we have about, did you know this was coming? How worried were you about this event? Different elements of risk perception. And we can combine all of that information. A core part of our analyses of the survey data is actually multi-level modeling and looking at how all of these different factors are playing together over time. And so, yeah, it's ultimately, we can't get down to that sort of element, but of course, that's going to be a piece of our general ideas when we look at our results.
The reason I ask is it's helpful to know because if, I was thinking, are we in sort of an adaptation space or in an anticipatory behavior phase, or even in that kind of in-between phase, like coping behaviors? And so you have a really unique opportunity, so that's why it's.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, we tend to, because this is a NOAA project, we tend to focus a lot on what would weather forecasters and the communicators of weather data like to know. And a lot of this project is focused on how we can potentially intervene in real time to help clear up misconceptions or lacks of particular information. So every project kind of has a focus, but we do ask a lot of different dimensions that I think there's a lot of different potential research questions that we could look at here. So I appreciate you mentioning that. I'll have to look up that paper too.
So I have a question. So one of the data sets I just saw in passing that it had like a list of the vehicle types colored, and I know it's like bus on there, private. And I'm curious about like, if they're either in future research or thinking about the way people use like transportation to, avoid risk. And I was just thinking like, oh, well, what if you're like someone who like takes a public bus, and do you then still do that same route if you're experiencing this like sort of hazard? The focus on this seems very much like private vehicle ownership and the risk perception around that. So I'm curious if there's like some other component of like mass transit or transportation that is maybe thought of as like a risk or something that might be a potential research question, especially if you get the data where it kind of delineates that out, like,
Sure.
like those sorts of like dynamics. So I don't know if that's like a question or if it's clear.
I think that's an excellent illustration of something that with the survey alone, we didn't address. We had to make cuts. And so we
Right.
really did focus on private driving. But with the transportation data, that's certainly an avenue that we can approach. We can sort of broaden our idea of transportation because clearly people in large urban areas, a lot of them don't have cars. I mean, LA is maybe special where it's really spread out. And so there are probably, at least in the burbs, there's definitely a lot of car usage. But I think that's an excellent, illustration of why bringing in other data sets can actually help you sort of broaden your research questions. And so hopefully with the data we get, we can
And I
address
think
that.
that builds on like what Matt was saying of like, it's the consideration of when the risk is like your own, like I'm driving my own vehicle versus like relying on someone else to know like whatever, like governmental policies about like public transportation and like turning around, that's sort of thing.
Right, and experience. I mean, were you ever on transportation, like when this, it got flooded and the lines got flooded, you got stranded? There's a lot of different dimensions there that are really interesting.
And just to add to that, I think that opens the question because, so with that vendor that give you that data about the buses, so the pro is like, you have different sources, but at the same time, we don't know if that's a commute related to work. So if they're commuting because they have to work and that's the commute they take, that probably will get out of the data that we might include. So that one of the reasons we're leaning more to the device oriented, like the unique device ID, is because there is a way that we can identify like, hey, this movement happening here is in a vehicle, for example. We don't know if that's a privately owned or is an Uber or is a bus, but we know that there is a movement going on and we have, in that case, the opportunity to differentiate like, hey, we don't know that the people in this bus, or like this cluster of points that are moving potentially in a bus are moving. We don't know if it's a bus. We kind of infer that it might be, but we have the option to remove like, hey, out of these 10 points that we see here, 2 are not doing a commute. So those 2 points will be the ones that we will be considered.
I'm just curious about the survey component as well, thinking about behaviors and behavior modification, and also been thinking about prior exposures. So I'm wondering if in your survey data, you're able to discern whether people have prior experiences that may be informing their behaviors in this particular this particular event.
Yeah, we absolutely do ask about that. I would love, do you want to, this is Julie's
Yeah.
wheelhouse, so I'd love her to speak on it.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. So Andrea's pulling on me because that was a lot of my focus in my dissertation research, is to try to nuance the types of experiences people have with hazardous weather and look to see how those different types of experiences shape their different dimensions of the risk perception. That was really my focus, and of course, you could extend that then into their behavioral responses. And we do, we measure that only on the first wave. So our dream also in the future is to have like a baseline survey of all of these people before there's an impending threat of any of these kinds of weather hazards, where we can measure this kind of stuff first. But the best way of us sort of operationalizing that was to ask it on wave one before this, even though the AR was threatening, they weren't actually being affected. Well, there was no sensible weather, basically. So we did measure, I'm trying to remember exactly how we measured it on the AR survey, pull it up. I don't know if Andrea remembers, like in the hurricane survey, we had asked whether or not they had damage, whether or not they had emotional experience, which is often often shown to have a strong relationship with their risk perception moving forward. I actually can pull up to see exactly how so we measured it in a number of different ways. We haven't looked at those kind of variables in conjunction with the analysis yet, because we have been really focused on mobility pieces of this, but it is something we intend to look at in the future. And one thing we didn't mention, we haven't put, because we want the instruments to be available. Andrea shared the NOAA report. For the hurricane stuff so far, we have our instruments on Design Safe, so we can share those DOIs so that people, so that people have access to that. Eventually, we will be sharing those data too. We haven't put the AR surveys on Design Safe yet, but we'll do that in case anybody else wants to access them.
I can actually send those to Slack after this.
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to look at the actual survey instruments.
I also just shared a book chapter that we have kind of back to the previous question about Andrea's response, that we have about using these kind of longitudinal data to examine risk perception and behavioral responses to natural hazards and generally to call for this kind of more broadly in the community. So I posted that as well.
I just have a question about how this fits into like maybe a larger framework where often when we're studying a disaster, we look at it after it happens, much after it happens, and at a, asking people to recall something that might have occurred within a year. So, and this is really true with like flooding events where like even in the flooding community, the community of flood modelers, like we still don't do the modeling at like the hourly level, for example, and maybe it's the hour that matters. So and then of course, the decision is made instantaneous, and the demographers in the room will know that instantaneous hazards are something we like to think about sometimes. So I'm wondering if, like, you thought about how this would compare to other kinds of data types that have been, how much more can you learn, and also how long lasting these, like, which of these effects that you will be able to observe will be long lasting. Or could be both long lasting and then observable in other formats, in the sort of long format, or are we just missing that one in the annualized way that most of our like nationally representative or state specific, big state surveys that might be undertaken are otherwise limited. So if you don't have that on your agenda, try to get it on your agenda, like somebody should find you to add that to it, because I think that'd be a nice addition. And then I would also love to see in your presentation, since this was a survey, what kind of response rates you had.
Of course,
and other
yeah.
things. I mean, we like to see that.
Threw that together, unfortunately. I can tell you the ballpark. Wave one, we had about 1,500 responses. By wave two, we're down to about 1,200. By wave three, we were down to about 1,100. We did invite everybody back to wave three that was invited to wave one. So that, we would love to get 3 time points for every person, but 2 time points will give us a trend. So the idea being to maximize those response rates.
And do you have any sense that people who were most impacted were like less likely to respond because they couldn't otherwise, there's systematic bias in who they would respond?
I think that's quite possible here, especially for such a localized event, because we're already sort of biased in that we're not getting a lot of people in any one individual location. So with the hurricane studies, we did look at a breakdown. We defined 2 different sets of groups for each wave of people who we considered most exposed to risk. Those are the people that were, for the hurricanes, were in the storm surge warnings, the hurricane warnings, sort of the prime area where the impacts were expected to be the greatest. And we did not see a a meaningful difference in demographics, at least between these two groups. So we're still working on that. Julie is actually, we're in the middle of reviews for our BAMS paper, and so we've been investigating all of that. But these are all really important questions, and this is such a new, I mean, this is costly, and so no one's wanted to do this before. I mean, we were lucky we got the support to actually try it. And then we managed to do it, bam, 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 3 years in a row, when we successfully at least got data. And now we're in the process of how do we do this better? Because we know there's a lot of methods in survey collecting that need to be respected. There's a lot of ethics and there's a lot of representativeness issues with using a company like YouGov that we need to work out, but we're getting the data and we're getting it fast. And so that was sort of step one. And to your note about the fact that we do often collect this information after the fact. So after something has occurred, we ask people to recall. We're trying to do all of this research really situated in the context of all of that work that's been done. There's been a lot of survey work with hypotheticals. And then there's been a lot of work with surveys after the fact. And then there's been a lot of work with longitudinal more on the yearly sense, I think what you were talking about. And so this is just sort of a new phase where we're trying to do short-term longitudinal. We're trying to capture that really intense period where people are making those quick decisions. But we are definitely trying to also situate that in the context and how does this fit into all of the research that is being done, that has been done. So, and Julie, I know you have more better things to say about that.
The other thing I'll add to this is we had done some work trying to, I want to echo what Andrew said, all your questionings are exactly what motivated us to want to do this, because most of this has been done sort of retrospectively, like after the fact. About a decade ago, we were trying to collect Twitter narratives to see if we could use that to kind of get the longitudinal aspect of people who are at risk of Hurricane Sandy, who are actually in evacuation orders. But like Andrea said, I mean, Twitter is limiting in a lot of different ways. There were some folks out of Wharton who had done longitudinal trend surveys, like doing phone surveys that actually surveying different people while Hurricane Sandy and Isaac were approaching. And so that was also nice data that we built on. But as far as we know, this is new in the sense of exactly to get at those questions. It's like, well, there was a lot, coming from atmospheric science, we fully appreciate that the hazards are dynamic. And we haven't been able to look really robustly at how people are dynamic in response to those hazards. And like Andrea said, we had to just come up with a methodology of we wanted to do this longitudinal panel survey, event-driven, sort of prospectively. And even design the ability to do that and collect the data and see if it would even work. And like Andrew said, who are we missing and what are the response rates? And we contacted a lot of companies. Only one of them basically said they could even think about doing this with us for like under $500,000 or something like that.
Not our budget.
Not our budget. But even I think everybody can appreciate this, that when you have a grant that's maybe $500,000, if a fifth of that goes to data collection, you're losing a lot, but you're making those choices intentionally. And we were just talking this morning about how that in the field of atmospheric science, we invest hundreds of millions of dollars of collecting atmospheric and oceanic observations, that kind of thinking about collecting these kind of data is just a drop in the bucket. But there is still a lot that we're learning, a lot that we're changing, a lot of additional analysis to do. So, yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
Just mention the hands-on to Jason's part, and then we'll do the part after. As that, and then maybe we shorten the discussion.
Yeah.